Welcome to the Inside the Box podcast. I'm your host, Hans Zappin, and I am thrilled to be joined in studio today by the Democratic candidate for House District 48, Mary Robichaux. Thank you very much for joining me on the show today.
Well, thank you, Hans, for having me.
Like I tell everybody, I like to use this platform and this opportunity to give voters, given that it is election season, a better understanding and idea of the candidates that they'll be voting on. So if we could, let's start out. I'd just like to know a little bit more about you. What's your background?
So my background is healthcare. I have 35 years in the healthcare management area at places such as Johns Hopkins up in Baltimore, and then at Emory Healthcare. And then for the last 10 years, I was the vice president for the American Heart Association for the Division of Quality for the Southeast.
Okay. And what were your responsibilities in that role?
So my role was I directed and worked with a team of clinical experts and quality and efficiency experts across the South, working with about 700 hospitals and probably over 10,000 physicians and healthcare providers, making sure that cardiovascular care, because we were the Heart Association, that it was delivered in a manner that was cost-effective, efficient, and reducing health disparities. So every person got the right care every time. So we worked through that, training models, monitoring data, looking for ideas to develop what we call systems of care across states.
Okay. So I'm sure you have a lot to say about today's current healthcare environment.
I have a little knowledge there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know if so much to say. I've worked in multiple states in helping to enact laws to provide better care, including here in Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee. So in a lot of ways, there's ways we can do it well, and when you include everyone, but in my previous role, always keeping the patient as the focus.
Okay. Well, let's circle back to that. I do want to ask you some more about that. But so how long have you lived in Roswell? We'll start there.
I've lived in Roswell 25 years.
Okay, and you're over in the Willow Springs area?
Yeah, Willow Springs, over off Old Alabama.
Okay, and what brought you to Roswell originally?
My husband's job.
Okay.
So we had moved around a good bit. He was a consultant with one of the large consulting firms. So we moved both from Louisiana, Maryland, Virginia, New York, here. He spent some time in Ireland, Brussels.
Wow.
So we've kind of been around. But,
okay.
So yeah, we landed here.
And then put your roots down here.
Here, yeah. Okay. And then he went to work for Coca-Cola for a time and then has started his own companies.
Okay. And what sorts of things in the community outside of work have you been involved in since you've been here in Roswell? So
my husband and I raised twin sons here in Roswell, so a lot of it did have to do with their education. So we served on multiple boards in the public school system when our boys were in school, including I was actually on the Fulton County Disciplinary Board as the parent representative for 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah, that was an interesting time.
Mm-hmm.
You get to see a lot of ways in which education works very, very well and where we need to still make improvements for all of our students. We did, I've done a volunteer mentorship with Habitat for Humanity for a year, been involved in the neighborhood, so just with our church, those kinds of things.
Okay. So we talked a little bit before the show about sort of your entry into politics. This is your first political race?
Very first.
What on earth made you want to get involved in politics?
At this time, it really did have to do with that. I just felt we needed to get back to the point where we could have adult conversations with each other. We could understand our differences, because we're going to have differences. That's okay. But we needed to talk, to listen to each other. In my role with the Heart Association, or what I've always really done in healthcare management, was to bring divergent voices together, to listen to everyone, and to come up with solutions and not just yell and scream at each other. And I think we need to get away from that.
Okay. What was your process like for ultimately making that decision? I'm sure you had a conversation with your family.
Had a very long conversation with my family. It took us about 5 months. I went through a very rigorous process. I actually read the Georgia Constitution and all of the laws, mainly because one of my sons is an assistant district attorney in Savannah. So okay. I had to read the laws, or he was quizzing me.
What kind of advice did he give you?
Just to be yourself, that understand that I'm not an expert in everything. I'm knowledgeable in a lot, but not in everything, to listen to people and to seek advice when you need it.
I think that sounds like great advice, and I'm always intrigued when I'm interviewing people who are first-time candidates, who are coming out of the corporate world or the nonprofit world and ultimately make that decision to make a run for public office. So I do want to ask you, after you initially made your announcement to run, what has your experience been like thus far as a candidate?
I'm going to say it's been great, meeting a lot of great people on both sides. We have been out talking to people. I've knocked on probably almost 4,000 doors now across my district.
Over what kind of period of time there?
I started knocking back in around April, May, even though I did not have a primary challenger, but I still felt in certain areas just to get out. But that was very soft. But ever since I knew who my challenger would be, I started really hitting the streets, I guess we'd say, going to a lot of meetings, going to also areas that one would say are traditionally more Republican versus Democrat, or vice versa, and just talking to people. And I've had great experiences from both sides. The Democratic people that we've met have given us hugs, talking about what's important to them. And then when I've talked to Republicans, it's very interesting because a lot of them will start the conversation that they really at first don't want to talk, and then after a few minutes will say, well, wait a minute, we agree on a lot of things. We may disagree on how we get to certain points, but we could talk together and come up with solutions. It doesn't have to be only my way or only your way. We have to figure this out together. That's what makes this country great, in my opinion.
No, I agree. Any funny or crazy stories so far going door to door?
Well, so I guess it's on both sides. On my Republican side, there was a gentleman who stopped me. So I was wearing my campaign shirt, and people by now know I'm a Democratic candidate. And he walks up to me, and his first words to me are, well, I'm a Republican. And I said, that's great. I'm a Democrat. Do you want to talk? And then he looks at me, and we talked for about 2 to 3 minutes. And then the next words are like, well, you're not a crazy. And I'm like, well, thank you. Neither are you. Do you want to keep talking? And so we just continued to have the conversation. And, after about 5 minutes, he said, I'm not sure if I could vote for you, but at least you made me see that there are some Democrats who aren't crazy. And I said, that's really what this should be about.
Sure.
We're not, just because we have differences, we're not crazy. My other favorite one, and for me, this is never having been in politics, and not that your face becomes known, that you don't even think about that aspect. We were canvassing, knocking on some doors, and we knocked on this one woman's door, and she peeked through the peephole and said, go away, I don't want to talk to you. And we said, okay, thank you. I turned around and started walking away, and we're almost to the streets. She throws open her doors and said, you, come back here. She goes, I have your picture. It's you. A candidate is knocking on my door, something that no one has done in approximately 20 years, which was amazing to me. So then we talked. So I guess it's on both sides. People just want to be, treated with respect and heard.
And going back to what you mentioned about being a Democrat running against a Republican incumbent, I do think there's a lot to be said for having an open dialogue and showing that there are more things that we can agree on than we can disagree on, or that we do disagree on. Are we missing that kind of conversation on a national scene? And do you see anything that you could do as a locally elected public official to maybe work towards fixing some of those things?
Well, I do see that. I think we have become it's tribal. And we've always had some differences. And I'm one of 7 children, and we span the entire spectrum of the political world. I have some very staunch Republicans in my family, and I have some very liberal, very, very liberal. And we can talk to each other, and we know there are certain things we're just never going to agree on. That's okay. But we would always come to help each other out. I want to get back to that. At the local level, again, I think within the State House, I just plan to listen to everyone. My scientific training, I will base my decisions on the facts and look at that, learn. I know I'm not an expert in everything, but we can learn from each other. I know how to study facts and seek advice from people that I trust or those that are going to give me different advice, and that's good. I think what I'm hoping is that when we see more and more of that, and it needs to come from both sides, that we can talk to each other. I think what truly does happen when the cameras are off, no offense, is very different than what we might see out in the camera. And that's, on both sides, we need to work in that middle ground. I know some people say that's not, but we have to.
Have you thought at all about, should you be elected, what types of things and ways that you will continue to have conversations with your constituents on both sides of the aisle?
Hopefully, when elected, I already have plans to have at least quarterly open forums at different both church places of worship and at restaurants that we've been having already. We have a monthly, well, I actually have one every week, but I'm going to go to quarterly to start, and it's going to be an open invitation to any and everyone to come and talk to me.
Kind of a town hall forum? Kind
of a town hall forum. Okay. I'm not the most technologically savvy person because of my age, but we hope to also have the concept of here's a place where you can ask me questions, and I'll do my best to answer it within 24 to 48 hours. When I worked in healthcare, that's how we did it. My team, you had 48 hours, you had to answer any question, even if it was just to say, I don't have an answer yet.
Sure, and we'll get back to you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So those kinds of things.
Okay. Well, let's jump into your platform a little bit. Talk to me about a few of the things that are really important to you that would continue to be important to you in the state legislature.
So obviously with my healthcare background, number one is going to be healthcare.
Okay.
I do believe we need to expand Medicaid. We need to take back the taxes that we've been sending away. Number one, it will be not only would we cover close to 500,000 more Georgians, but we would create jobs. It's an economic driver. We need to do this for our residents, period. It would also allow some ways in which we could affect the opioid epidemic that's going on in Georgia and some other things. So healthcare expansion. And when I say that, but I would also look at the ways in which insurance companies that are in Georgia, the coverage they provide, I want to make sure that if they're here in Georgia, that they're doing the best for our citizens. In other words, not allowing insurance companies to say whether or not that was a good ER visit and whether we're going to pay for it or not, which is what's going on now. And I don't agree with that.
Okay. So you would be a yes on Medicaid expansion?
I would be a yes on Medicaid expansion.
Okay. And you mentioned the opioid crisis. I know the North Fulton area has been very involved in combating that crisis, and specifically Roswell Rotary Club has been very involved in that as well. What's sort of your take on some next steps that we can do as an area, but also as a state, to work towards those efforts?
Well, again, identifying the problem. I don't think people, if you put your head in the sand, it's not going to go away. And I think they've started to do that. One of the major things is to look at alternative treatment plans. Again, having insurance companies cover those treatment plans, because addiction treatment is a long-term problem. Especially, we know scientifically, people who are addicted, it's a chemical issue in the brain. We need to affect that. A lot of insurance companies, it's great if you can afford the treatments, but not everyone can. So again, even the Medicaid type expansion would help cover those things. Just educating our student bodies. There's some great work being done about, it only takes one time, depending on who you are. Okay. So those kinds of things.
Okay. And then in the news recently, there's been a lot of discussion centered around the fact that for the first time in a while, the state is fully funding education. I know there's also been a lot of back and forth about what exactly that means and what formula they're using and the timing of it, given that it's an election year. What are some things centered around education that you would want to work towards?
So I applaud that we did finally fully fund education, but it was at a level of a 30-year-old model. And we need to look at that. I do not believe our teachers need to be buying their own supplies. I think they need a better pay raise. Their retirement and pensions need to be fully funded. I do believe in the public education system. My twin sons went through the Fulton County Public School System, 1st through 12th grade. They were National Merit Scholars and got scholarships to great schools, and both have great careers now. Every student should have the same opportunities that my son had in the public school system. I believe we need to look also to develop partnerships with businesses into especially our high schools and middle schools. What is it that our businesses are going to need in the future that we should be training people for and not rely on things we don't know? Those kinds of things. What's going to happen in the 22nd century? We're heading there. Are we ready for it? I do not I believe that it should be public schools, and that we should not use our tax dollars to pay for students who go to private schools.
Okay.
Other than if there's a really special needs that the public school cannot meet.
Okay. And I was going to ask you what your plans were to help fund some of those efforts. So you would be in favor of revoking that?
The $100 million? Yes,
yeah.
I would.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else that you can think of that you'd want to look to either increase revenues or additional cuts to help fund some of those efforts?
I think we just need to, I'm not sure if I would increase revenues. I think I'd look at the way in which we're spending the revenues we have before I'd start saying I'm going to increase revenues or increase taxes. I know that's a big, bad word.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have a lot of money. We just need to make sure our priorities are correct in education. You know, we did a study here in North Fulton. We were not able to get the data for every student that's already in private schools. If you would go to the concept of, the money follows the student, that's almost $10 million a year, the day one, that Fulton County school systems would lose without one more student going to a private school. That's a lot of money.
Okay. Well, and speaking of education and moving further into the future, as technology continues to advance and it affects our workforce here in the state, have you put any thought at all into some things that you could do as a state representative to help make up for some of those jobs that maybe are being automated or jobs that maybe we're losing overseas, things like that, some workforce development type goals?
So one of the first things I think, again, in Georgia, we need to expand broadband. We are in an area, obviously, here in the North Fulton area. It's not one of our issues, but in parts of Georgia, it's very much an issue. I've traveled across some of those very rural areas, and there's nothing there that when you try to get your phone or your computer, so they cannot compete with our students up here. So we need to, number one, make sure that they have access to broadband before we can even do the technological training. And then I think we need to look at those concepts. Where are we going? What's going to be the biggest needs? Is it going to be, working within the military? There's a lot of opportunity there to educate. There's some programs going on now across the country in that certain military bases or training programs partner with their local schools to say these are the kinds of people and training we need, when they turn 18. Not even if they don't want to enter the military, but then they're ready to go to work for people who will work within the military complex. That's just one of the things. I think we're looking at those things.
Okay. I did want to ask you a little bit about the governor's race. It's a race that is being watched across the country. Stacey Abrams has been in the news, it seems like, both for some good things, and it seems like she's tripped up a little bit along the way. Same with Brian Kemp. Do you have any just general thoughts about the race and what the implications are no matter who wins that race across the country?
Well, I think across the country, but I also, want to bring it back to Georgia too. And I think it's not just the governor's race; it's the entire ticket. When you think about, from my perspective, things such as it's the lieutenant governor who actually can help set the agenda within our legislation. It's our attorney general who can also help and look at things. Obviously, it's our Secretary of State is also somewhat in the news, and we need to have someone there, from my perspective, who really will be for voters' rights and looking for those kinds of things and operating in that manner. Between Stacey and Brian, I just believe more in Stacey's tenet. Obviously, Medicaid expansion, I believe we need a lot of her ideas or things that I believe in. I might not agree with everything, but pretty much overall, I believe she would be better for us. I'm not overall impressed in how the Secretary of State's offices have been handling a lot of the issues around voter issues, but also around business issues that go through the Secretary of State's office. So, and I'm not saying Stacey's perfect, but I just believe in her.
Do you believe that Brian Kemp is actively participating in voter suppression in the state?
I'm not going to say actively participating. I'm going to say there have been systems that have been developed that make it harder for certain groups of people to vote or that causes a fear. It's not something I've ever experienced, but I am not the person that would be affected by that. My 93-year-old father lives with me. Now, I can do certain things for him. He's not voting, but if my 93-year-old father didn't have someone who could help him do things, he couldn't handle some of the stuff.
Sure.
The concept of, well, it's much better to go online to register if you've not voted. Well, that's true, but not everyone is comfortable there, much less we don't have broadband across the state. How are you going to register online if you don't have broadband, much less have used a computer a lot? So I think in certain ways we've made it, the concept of that electronically is easier, yes, but we have to understand that not everyone has that same level of understanding or comfort there. So I'm not going to say active. I think some of the laws and things that are there, I don't agree with the removing of voters who haven't voted after a certain time. It's your right to vote. If you choose not to exercise it, that's still your right. Why are you losing that? I just don't agree with it.
Would you be in support of legislation that would look at automatic voting registration here in the state?
Yes, I would.
Okay. Well, last question for you. As you're making your closing arguments and you're going door to door, you're talking to constituents, when you run across someone who maybe has voted for your opponent in the past, you are running against an incumbent House representative, what is your message to them as to why they should change their vote this time and vote for you?
Main message is that I just believe here in Roswell, we need a new voice. We've had, in a lot of ways, the same voice representing us, and I believe I can solve problems. I can bring people together. I listen to multiple people. I will represent people with honest integrity, with ways in which that everyone will feel they've heard. You may not agree with me, and I'm okay with that, but I'll explain why I voted or acted that way in a way that hopefully people will really understand and feel that they could accept.
Okay. And if someone wants to find out a little bit more about your platform or wants to get involved in your campaign, what are some of the best ways to do that?
Right now, the best way is to go to our website. It's electmaryrobichaux.com, and we'll be responding to you. You can ask me a question on the website. We're answering all questions. You can, of course, volunteer. You can also read all of my position papers and issues. And we've actually posted about 10 videos, about 2-minute videos. So they're long. I don't want to give you that they're not. That you can sit there and listen to me talk about what I would do on different things, such as social justice reform and transportation, economic development, some of the other things we didn't talk about today.
Okay.
And it tells a little bit more about my story with myself and my son that was born with a heart defect and has had multiple open heart surgeries, and why it's so important we have coverage for people.
Okay. Well, make sure to check those videos out and be an informed voter if you're listening to the show today. And Mary, I do want to thank you very much for being on the show and for telling us about your message and what your platform is.
Well, thank you, Hans. And you made this very easy for my very first time on a podcast.
Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.